Phil Petty, number 14 for Carolina in those Lou Holtz Russell uniforms. The graphic here is, and the Gamecock football Twitter account just saying our hearts are heavy as we mourn the loss of a great Gamecock. Shane Beamer also tweeting out his thoughts yesterday. So sorry to hear the news of Gamecock football great Phil Petty passing away. Thoughts and prayers to his family. Ryan Brewer posting the picture of Phil Petty holding up the United States of America flag in the pregame ceremony at Mississippi State, where the Gamecocks were the first sports team to fly after 9/11. And Phil Petty featured prominently there right before the game. It's an iconic picture. When I think of Phil Petty, that's the first one that comes to mind. And I know Ryan and Phil were close. Ryan tweeting out, our teammate, quarterback leader, inspiration, and brother, love you more than you know, will miss you dearly. Popped up another picture of he and Phil more recently, looks like at a Gamecock tailgate. And friend of the show there, you just saw in the intro, Eric Kemry, one of our first guests, former Gamecock assistant, and was Phil Petty's backup quarterback. I texted with Eric last night. He's on the football field over in Chattanooga right now, coaching the Baylor school in preseason practice, and admitted even if he was not, he's just not ready to talk about it right now. And I completely understand that, those who are close to Phil Petty and how raw it is, and want to respect that for sure. That's why we'll read Eric's series of 5 tweets here. I think is a proper way to start remembering Phil Petty today. Phil Petty will be missed, Eric Kimry says. He was a competitor and leader, intelligent, thoughtful, gritty as heck, and our QB1. Though he is no longer here, his spirit lives. His legacy will remain steadfast at the University of South Carolina. Second tweet from Eric Kimry. Phil took the beating of a 21-game losing streak, got off the ground, wiped the mud off his hands and the grass out of his face mask, and led us to the 2 most successful seasons in school history at that time. If anyone has embodied the spirit of a Gamecock, it was him. Phil Petty beat Georgia, Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State twice. He loved football and had a great understanding of the game. He made everyone in the huddle believe we could win. He made us all better. Most importantly, Phil was a husband and a father and a loving son. He was kind to strangers and loved talking ball with Gamecock fans. He was so proud of his kids, sending us videos of his son throwing a ball an awful lot like his dad. For us that got the privilege to play with him, he was our brother. We shared a brotherhood that never went away and never will. Love you, 14, Eric Kimry concludes. I'll always be your backup, forever to thee. And Phil Petty actually was returning to Columbia this year to be an assistant coach, co-offensive coordinator at Gray Collegiate Athletics. Had gotten into coaching after a year of trying to make it in the NFL, and went with Skip Holtz to East Carolina. And then his coaching career took a break after Holtz split with East Carolina, and now he was getting back into high school football coaching this year. My personal memory of Phil Petty, he's a year younger than me. I transferred into the University of South Carolina my sophomore year, his redshirt freshman year, and I had no clue, being from North Carolina. My dad had gone to South Carolina, so I'd always gone down to football games. Went to basketball camp and baseball camp. But from a student life perspective, I didn't know anything about attending the University of South Carolina. So they asked me where I want to live. I'm like, oh, live in the Roost. That's where the athletes live. That's got to be the best place to live. So that's where I was my first year. Phil Petty was there as well. Got in an elevator one time, and in comes Phil Petty, who I certainly knew who it was. He had a solid reputation. Me being a sports nerd, I knew who the quarterback was. or who one of the quarterbacks on the roster was. Anthony Wright was the guy on campus at the time, and Phil Petty was a redshirt freshman, but he got in. He had a pizza, and as I remember it, remember him saying that this is all for me, trying to gain some weight, where he was as a redshirt freshman. But overall, Phil Petty to me embodies a steady quarterback who everyone looks to as a leader and a guy who stepped up time and time again. The prevailing memory yesterday was Alabama touchdown late to Rodney Trafford over the middle, 2001, to win that game 37-36. On the road a couple of weeks before that at Georgia, throws it up. Brian Scott makes the catch for the Gamecocks to win that one 14-9. More of you guys weighing in on this thing. Tonester says, sad day for all Gamecocks. Justin Adams weighing in, was at the New Mexico State game as a 12-year-old back in 2000. My mom got a number 14 jersey right after. That was the game that broke the 21-game losing streak. Jason and Craig, we see you guys weighing in as well. If you have specific memories of Phil Petty, would love to hear them this morning. And tough news, at 43 years old, I saw Corey Jenkins, who played with Phil just that last season in 2001, talking to WLTX yesterday, and struggled to get through it. Just talking about how tomorrow is not guaranteed for any of us. We don't know our time. It's important to take advantage of our time here and not take it for granted. Trier head coach now in Corey Jenkins, former Gamecock, and he put out on Twitter, "This one hurts. I will truly miss you, brother. Learned a hell of a lot from you in our days as Gamecock QBs. Our quarterback room was always fun, man. Rest easy, Phil P." With the hashtag RIP Phil Petty, brothers for life, and quarterback, and put the picture up of Phil Petty in the Garnet 14, the white helmet, with "I love you, brother," and RIP 14. A couple of other Gamecock teammates, offensive lineman John Strickland on Twitter with a couple of pictures, one of Phil Petty throwing the ball in that same Garnet uniform, another one of these two guys years later. Candid picture. Phil, it's been a tough morning to say the least. We have lost a great friend, brother, and teammate way too soon. I'm crushed and at a loss for words. I will always cherish the great memories we shared together at South Carolina and all the good times we've had since. After football, life after football, you will be deeply missed, my brother. RIP number 14. That's from John Strickland, former offensive lineman. Philip Jones was the center for Phil Petty for most, if not all, of those years on the Gamecock offensive line. He tweeted out a picture of a pre-snap with Phil right behind him saying, "Heartbroken, love you, my QB1, Phil Petty." Philip Jones, now a high school football coach as well. So just some of the reaction coming in about Phil Petty passing away at the age of 43. And tough news for a lot of Gamecock fans to process yesterday for sure. Craig says, "I'm sure the team will have number 14 on their helmets or jerseys this year." Nothing announced from the University of South Carolina, but certainly would not be surprised if something like that does happen. But a top 10 is Phil Petty. If you're a numbers person, talking about quarterbacks and yards, I think passing yards, I'm pretty sure career touchdown passes as well. A guy, again, who's just steady. And if you never saw him play, it's maybe even tough to describe. Like, not necessarily a guy who was known for a big arm or extremely accurate or extremely mobile, but really, really good at all of those things, right? Still good arm strength, still could make people miss every now and again enough. And maybe it's Jonathan Alston, I think, another former Gamecock teammate who I saw from our buddy Scott Eisberg, WCIV down in Charleston, talking to. And just, I think he was the one who mentioned just whatever he was asked to do, that's what he did. And it was a lot of run first, Lou Holtz offense back in the day. And Jonathan Alston mentioned that you never heard him complain and how important or how much he was respected that all these years later now, just being out in the business world and seeing how important that trait is to do your job and do it with a good attitude as a quarterback in an SEC school, especially to do it as a really good leader. And that's how I will remember Phil Petty. I think that's how a lot of Gamecock fans will remember number 14, Phil Petty, who has left us at the age of 43. So I thought it only appropriate to start the show that way. Again, if you have any specific memories or ways that you would like to remember a Gamecock quarterback, feel free to weigh in on the live stream here. Live comments from YouTube and Facebook pop right into the show, right to me, and I can pop them right in. If you hit us up on Twitter, I can see that and get it in. It's a little bit clunkier that way at Tim Hill UFA. You can always hit us up. Again, more than that one line from Eric Kemry today in 2022, and this will probably transition us to wrapping up SEC Media Days yesterday. But I got to read it again. I got to look at my notes just to make sure my brain will read the sentence out loud. Georgia, Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. Wins against those schools in the same year in 2001. Just in 1 year. Go back and double check that. But the fact that he did that, and Eric pointed out twice against Ohio State, but that was the same year. Going back in, so it was a 9-3 season where the only losses were Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas for the Gamecocks. In the same year, South Carolina football with Phil Petty running the show beat Georgia, Clemson, Alabama, and Ohio State, which is what has become the college football playoff, right? It's even more impressive now, 21 years later, that was part of the big time turnaround. And it wasn't just going from a team that lost mostly to a team that won. It was 21 games in a row on the losing side of things, and then having a program that could beat Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State in the same year. So when Shane Beamer does talk about doing something at South Carolina and how it can be done, and it has been done to a certain extent before, point back to 2001 if you're talking to someone who's uninitiated, and Phil Petty leading the Gamecocks to those wins against those four iconic programs who've dominated college football now the last several years. Nick weighing in this morning. He was my first glimmer of hope as a young Gamecock fan, talking about Phil Petty. I was barely old enough to remember the Tannehill days, but will always remember being in the stands for New Mexico State and Georgia the next week. Thanks, Nick, for contributing that to the program. The show is always better. You always make the show better when you contribute, especially at a time like this where I feel so inadequate, even having watched all of Phil Petty's career, even having been there in the stands for those first 2 years, that 21-game losing streak, and having gone to both of those Outback Bowls where South Carolina beats Ohio State. I didn't really know him. And I was texting with Eric Kemry last night because I was telling him I want to allow, if those who did know him, the opportunity to talk about him and to maybe help their process along. But I also want to be respectful of their privacy and uh, not be invasive there. And then from the fan standpoint, for those of you like Teddy, who says, my wife and I started dating in 1999. We were engaged and married in 2000, newlyweds in 2001, going to all the home games those years. Those were special years. We are deeply saddened for his passing. Roger, living in the upstate, I remember Phil Petty from probably his sophomore year at Boiling Springs High School when he was a starter there. He grew up a huge Gamecock fan. Brad Scott didn't have to sell much. Yeah, I saw Brad Scott also weighing in on an article in the state newspaper, I think, yesterday, just mentioning a good player and also a better person. I think Skip Holtz put something out on social media yesterday saying gone way too soon. So want to be respectful of those who were close to Phil Petty, but also honor his memory for Gamecock fans as well, and appreciate you helping to do that with your personal memories and perspectives on Phil Petty. Craig says, I've said it before, our son was born about an hour after we kicked a winning field goal to beat Ohio State. New Year's Day 2002, a special time in my life for sure. Daniel Weaver reference. Roger saying, he and Tommy Suggs mean more to me than the other Gamecock quarterbacks because they are from our state. I will remember how he carried himself well. What do you remember most about Phil Petty being the Gamecocks quarterback back in the day and unfortunately passing away at the age of 43?
I know. When I saw it yesterday, and I was talking to one of my former players this morning, as a coach, they stay the same age in your mind. So when I saw that tweet yesterday, I'm like, oh my God, how's a 20-some-year-old guy? What happened? You just forget that, okay, that was when I started my career. You know, when I was coming in South Carolina in 1998, he's coming in from Boiling Springs. And I'm going to be honest, he was a great baseball player. You know, we talked to some people yesterday. If he hadn't have been a football quarterback and Lou Holtz was trying to turn everything around, he could have played baseball at this level, most likely. He was a tremendous athlete. And back then, as I told some people yesterday, we shared the weight room back then with football. Basically, everybody went to Williams-Brice. There was no other weight room like now. There's, you know, each sport basically has one. So you saw him a lot. And I was a Gamecock fan. So when I went in that weight room, as I've told you the Lou Holtz stories, I was a fan in there. I was seeing Lou Holtz. You know, I'm looking at Phil Petty, who I know is coming to be the quarterback. And I would watch, and what a nice person. I mean, I just remember our players, I would always needle them a little bit to find out about a guy. Like, hey, what's so-and-so like? And, you know, we had Sheldon Brown. So I could say, hey, what's this guy like? I never heard any of them take a shot at him. There was jealousy all the time. I mean, guys, they were young kids. They're probably a girlfriend problem. There's something where normally they'd say this guy is this or that guy's that. No one ever said that about him. And when he would be around with our players, maybe you'd see him up in the, you know, the old Roost right there was the academic center, and there was a, you know, a lunchroom, and you'd see him. He always spoke, and he'd always say, hey, coach. And you know, you lose touch with these guys once they go into their real world. But it was amazing. As soon as I read that tweet yesterday, I see us at the Outback Bowl. I still have a blanket that Dr. McGee bought all of us that said, you know, 2000, whatever, Outback champion. And it was a sad day. And, you know, I pray for him, his family. But as a Gamecock fan, boy, you talk about handling adversity. I mean, for what those guys went through to go 1-21 at the beginning of their career, and to then turn it around and win 9 games, win bowl games, it showed a lot about him. And he just always seemed to be, you know, their captain when I would see him in that environment.
Steady, I think, is maybe the word that comes to mind. And what you got to have, I think, is priority number one for a quarterback. I mean, you got to be talented, like you mentioned, and he was. But if I'm ever – I'm going to eventually know. I'm going to tell my kids about him, right? And I think steady will probably be it, and leader, and a guy that in the critical moments came up big on the field for sure, but also what you mentioned, like off the field, going through that, man, as the leader of a team is not easy. And Eric Kemry had a tremendously appropriate and, as usual, fitting tribute to Phil Petty yesterday on Twitter, just a series of 5 tweets. And one of those, I think it might have even started with how difficult it was, how many hits he took, and going 21 straight losses and being that guy and then turning it around, and how he embodied so many things that you want athletes to embody on the field and off the field in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and we said here this morning already, and we've talked about paying this and paying that, but you go back and you look at your Super Bowl teams, you go back and you look at national championship teams, and you look at what Phil Petty was for those bowl championship teams. You got to have a good quarterback. And as much as I sit here with my Cleveland hat on and joke, it's really ever hard to say we're in and we're going to win it when you don't even know who your quarterback is. That was the one thing that Phil Petty brought at a time where it seemed like we hadn't had one forever at South Carolina. He just brought a calmness to the quarterback position. I remember as a young kid growing up, you had the Mike Hold and those guys on that 84. You knew your quarterback. But it feels like I know Tannehill was in there kind of when I was in college, but you go from about the mid-'80s when Todd Ellis and those guys were gone, you didn't even know your quarterback was. You couldn't even name them. If someone said right now, Tim Hill, I'll give you $1 million to name the starting quarterback, and you throw some year like 1995, you'd have to sit there and go, who the heck was the quarterback then? Was it a transfer to come in? So he was the first guy you just remembered again. And some of my former players, gosh, I forget how young they were. They're like, he's the first Gamecock jersey I wanted. That's how young they were, that, he was a guy. I mean, we were on national TV winning, and that hadn't happened in, forever. So I think
just that, Stuart, 2001, Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State.
Yeah.
Beat all of those teams in the same season that now dominate college football. Yeah. Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State. And it was the second win against Ohio State in a row there in the Outback Bowl. I was, I watched all those games. I lived all of that. Phil Petty was not my first guy. I was already out of college at that point, but just to see that again and to see the perspective of that now makes it even more impressive. And Phil Petty deserves a ton of that credit.
Yeah, I don't think as Gamecock fans, we've slowed down enough to realize what happened even back then. I don't think we get enough. We kind of all got caught up in Coach Spurrier's era. But for what really happened to go 1-21, can you imagine if social media had been as strong during that time? Oh. I mean, does a Lou Holtz survive? Does Lou Holtz have time to, as I told you that story when he said a couple of years, I want you to be scared walking in here because my guys are so big. And that's what he said to me and Coach Tolman standing there that day. Nobody in here scares you. Talking about his offensive lineman is what he meant, and defensive lineman. He understood clearly you don't win in the SEC unless your offense and defensive line are massive. And when we look back at Coach Spurrier's team, we had Connor Shaw, we had all these great people around, but think how big our defensive line was and our offensive line. I mean, those guys, but you got to have a guy. And I just remember, again, Phil Petty in that locker weight room, there was a lot of crazy stuff going on. But that dude just always was calm, seemed to always walk by you and say, hey, Coach, how you doing? He was never too caught up that he was out of it. So I think that's an error that sometimes gets forgotten of what they did to come back and do that.
All that Quincy Carter Heisman talk, Nick says. Phil Petty came in, took care of business. Quincy Carter threw 5 picks. What a game. That was win number 2 after the 21-game losing streak there. New Mexico State win number 1, and then Quincy Carter comes in, preseason Heisman guy. Jan weighing in says, I guarantee you people in Columbus, Ohio know the name Phil Petty. That's a good point, Jan. All these years later, 20-plus years later, Phil Petty, he's a legend for sure. And you're probably right. Probably not talked about as much because, Ryan Brewer was such a legend at that time and got a bunch of that credit, especially in the Outback Bowl game and the story against Ohio State and the whole thing is that. But I think that also embodies who Phil Petty was too. Like, not a necessarily guy that everyone in the SEC is talking about, right? But just solid. And now you look back on it and say, oh man, he accomplished a ton.
Well, and it just goes into his private life. Like, I'll be honest, I don't know what he had done once his career had been over. But then as soon as yesterday happened, you just start seeing tweets and things from people saying how he was still a leader of their group. I mean, he was still the guy that they wanted him to be around them. So it's a tremendous, and he was a South Carolina guy. I mean, we feel like at this school a lot of times, well, we got to get a national guy. You got to get a national guy. We got from Boiling Springs, South Carolina. I mean, he was a guy that had grew up in this state that all the high school coaches, I follow so many are friends with them yesterday. It was just cool to hear the high school coaches were so proud as they are. So many of these South Carolina kids have gone on to be successes here. But it's a sad day, and to be that young, and hopefully it's something that they can have a tribute to him this football season too, and can be remembered for what he did. Because I'm going to tell you, as a Gamecock fan, I was a Gamecock coach at the time. Boy, that when they started winning, how much better it made all of us feel. And that was a big deal.
The Cotton Gin there in 5 points, putting up a tribute. This is a picture from their Twitter, RIP Phil Petty, forever to thee. Connor Shaw putting out his thoughts on Twitter yesterday. My last interaction with Phil, throwing the ball around with his son on the sidelines before a Carolina game last fall. All we talked about was our families. Really saddened to hear the news today, praying for his family. I know he was very proud of them and recently returned to Columbia to help coach Gray Collegiate Athletics. Had a college assistant coaching career with Skip Holtz at East Carolina. Some of the post-graduate, post-South Carolina things that Phil Petty was into. And again, just all across the board, so many thoughts and prayers for his family, his kids, and a lot of great memories on the football field for Gamecock fans in so many ways. But the turnaround that Lou Holtz led from 21 straight losses to 2 straight Outback Bowl wins at the time. And again, it's one of those things that you might have heard, and you even know it was the best turnaround in the country, and one of the best in the history of college football. Jan says just physically nauseated all day yesterday after the news came down, and I know so many people were.